The Vietnam War, or the Second Indochina War, or the American War was a war that undeniably led to a great amount of loss. During it, over 1 million Americans and Vietnamese would come to die during the war. However, its portrayal during it and afterward would differ tremendously. Though the war gradually lost support over time, with many Americans coming to view it as an immoral cause, later generations would come to see things a little differently. Later generations believe that the Vietnam War was more justified, with different forms of media portraying the war in vastly different ways. How did they differ? How did American thoughts on the war change? Well, first, we need to look at the background of the war. After the beginning of the Cold War and the USSR's establishment of its Iron Curtain, Americans came to scapegoat communism as the world's greatest threat to democracy, and so they took extreme actions to keep communism from consuming the world. This began with financial aid to war-ravaged countries in the form of the Truman Doctrine, then to an active stance against communism with Kennan's idea of containment emerging, and eventually in the form of military pacts like NATO. John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State at the time, had this domino effect theory, that if one nation fell to communism, it would lead to an irreversible chain reaction, ending with the death of democracy, and America really likes its democracy. Now, having your rival try to one-up you isn't exactly something the USSR wanted to do, so in response they too provided their own form of financial aid to their war-ravaged countries, and made their own military pact, the Warsaw Pact. To maintain influence over their satellite states, the USSR forbade some satellite states from accepting financial aid that was offered to them in the Truman Doctrine. So then we get into the most dangerous game of chicken known currently, with each side amassing a great deal of nuclear arms and military threats. Now, America took its idea of containment pretty far, so when a certain communist China tried to back North Korea to invade South Korea, the US responded with military force. And although some controversies happened there, we know that it doesn't really go anywhere because we still have a North and South Korea today. However, it does show that America was really out to get communism. Additionally, fear of communism is really starting to add up now. The House Un-American Activities Committee is formed to investigate those that would even dare, spread, or be sympathetic to the big scary thing called communism. Due to American sentiment, those that were investigated were usually found guilty whether or not they were actually communists and had their lives and careers ruined as well. Specifically, HUAC went after those in the theater and entertainment industry. Additionally, we have a certain Joseph McCarthy come along and make such extreme accusations that important and powerful people in government and in other places were communists, leading to a huge witch hunt. So with the Red Scare coming to an all-time high, when a certain Vietnam looks like it's being threatened by communism, the United States does not even hesitate to help. But how can we do that legally? Wouldn't it be a shame if something happened in the Gulf of Tonkin? Oh no, we've been attacked by troops in Vietnam. Better call the entire army. And so the Vietnam War comes to be. But how does the media think of this? What do people think of this? Well, first, we need to realize that people are starting to realize that maybe communism isn't the best justification for their problems. Before the start of the Vietnam War, McCarthy's hearing against the US Army was televised, revealing his bullying ways and showed the lack of credibility some of his accusations held. McCarthy fell into obscurity. Also, the Vietnam War was the first televised war, allowing people to watch it from the comfort of your own home. People were exposed for the first time to the horrors of war and were able to see how it progressed. But in this case, even progression wasn't something you could track in this war. Similarly to the Revolutionary War, the North Vietnamese were fighting for their own idea of independence. It can't be killed through gained and lost land. So it would make sense that some newspapers would report pretty negatively about the war. After all, victories are hard to count when captured land doesn't matter. The New York Times' letter to the editor segment would reveal underlying doubt about the actual cause of the war, with one specific one by a government official claiming there was no reason to be in Vietnam. Press support would fall drastically too, after the Tet Offensive, which showed the public signs that North Vietnamese spirit would not be broken, despite the Tet Offensive's end in failure. The New York Times would once again report on soldiers' experiences on how returning home would be a dream. Popular music at the time reflected the soldiers' feelings about the war itself. One soldier personally recounted Fortunate Son and We Gotta Get Out of This Place as the war's most iconic songs. Fortunate Son spoke to the war's unfairness and class disparity, as those that went to college were exempted from the war. However, lower-class citizens were unable to afford such education and were thus forced into the war, with no alternative. We Gotta Get Out of This Place also displayed the same messages. People want to get out of bad situations, or at least make their own better. With the Vietnam War stifling opportunities many of these soldiers had, it would make sense that they want to get out. As the war went on, Americans began to realize that the North Vietnamese would never give up, and even more controversy was spurred by the questionable morals of the Vietnam War. Was containment really a justifiable cause for the war? The news reported even more negatively all the way to the end of the war and even after. Eventually, a new president comes along and pulls the US out of Vietnam. Saigon would fall shortly afterward. Many news companies would never forget the atrocities of the Vietnam War. Many would remember the tragedy that caused the death of 1 to 2 million Vietnamese citizens and the lasting impact that the Vietnam War would have on Vietnam as a country. Saigon would fall and be renamed, and the country's politics would be changed forever, with the destruction of the war affecting the people's lives even 30 years later. So how about other forms of media and culture? How is the war remembered there? In movies, some directors would choose to depict the horrors of the Vietnam War, like Casualties of War. It would depict the heinous acts some of the Americans made during the war, rape of the Vietnamese people. Another movie depicting the effects of Vietnam would be Platoon, which would show the psychological effects the war would have on the soldiers and the moral gray areas that those effects would lead them to. However, it would be incorrect to say that the Vietnam War would stay remembered as such. The glorification of war prevalent in American culture would prevent its horrors from being truly understood. Rambo: First Blood, although set 3 years after the Vietnam War, would take advantage of the Vietnam War's setting and situation to create an action thriller ignoring the historical importance of the war itself. In video games, unless you look deeply for it, you'd probably find many games that glorify it, although this is usually just because of the glorification of war in general. Remember Fortunate Son? Well, it got so iconic, it got licensed to be played in this game.
This is the Psychedelic Music Show at AFVN. I'm Army Specialist Zach Johnson. Our APO here is 96309. If you send a request to that number, what we do is we open it like this. When it arrives, we read it, pull out that record, and play it on the air. Like this one, Fortunate Son by
Woods, he's here.
Although it is due to the nature of video games meaning to be entertaining, these games generally involve settings that take place during the Vietnam War, removing any emotional attachment one would have to any of the soldiers and distorting the effects the war had on said soldiers. One could come to the conclusion that the Vietnam War would be remembered this way because of the emerging ignorance of the realities of war, or maybe due to new technologies and shifting perspectives. As the war ended and time passed, the American opposition to the war would only decrease. According to a poll in December 1967, 71% of respondents believed that the war would not come to a conclusion within a year. Anti-war sentiment likewise was at extreme highs. However, once another poll was asked in the 1990s, only 36% of respondents would say that they approved of the anti-war movement. You need to realize that this is not only because of time passing, but also because of innovations made this day. New information, well as the misunderstanding and ignorance of it, all contribute to the memory of the Vietnam War. However, this issue of misunderstanding and new information pertains to current issues, such as anti-vaccination movements and fear-mongering. The only way through these times is to question your sources and investigate further. In order to prevent something on the scale of another Vietnam War, one needs to keep themselves informed and accept different points of view. And that could start with doubting one little video you saw on the internet that presented itself as knowing what it said.